Welcome to Crosstalk Solutions. My name's Chris and this is FreePBX 101 version 15 part 21, where we're going to be talking about inbound routing or inbound routes. Basically, the idea of having calls come into your PBX and then distributing those calls throughout the PBX wherever they need to go. But before we dig into inbound routes, if you are enjoying this video tutorial series, make sure you give us a like and subscribe to Crosstalk Solutions for more content just like this. Also, you can follow me on Twitter at CrosstalkSOL for all of the latest updates. Okay, so from the dashboard of FreePBX, we can get rid of this error now since I created those outbound routes previously. We're going to say connectivity and inbound routes. And right now we have the default inbound route that I set up when I was doing SIP trunk testing, but we're going to set this up from scratch. Let's go ahead and delete that one and click OK. And we're going to say add inbound route. The first thing that I like to do for any PBX system is create a catch-all or default inbound route. That's basically an inbound route that is the route of last resort if we have multiple inbound routes and we have not matched the caller ID or inbound phone number from any of the other routes. So we're going to call this default. And by the way, if that is confusing, it will be much clearer by the end of this video. And so here we have two settings, DID number and caller ID number. Now these are two different ways that we can route inbound calls. DID number routes inbound calls based on the phone number that was dialed, right? So someone out there in the world dialed one of my phone numbers. Which phone number did they dial? And we're going to route based on that phone number. But since we are leaving it blank, we're basically saying match any phone number that dials into the system. The other way that we can match calls is by caller ID number. Basically, what is the caller ID of the person who's calling in? Here's an example. If you had a list of clients that were sort of priority or VIP clients and you wanted to make sure that anytime someone calls in from this particular phone number, we want to send them to a priority queue so that they get escalated support or something like that, right? Just one example of how this could be used. Now, for a lot of these settings, you will never touch them, and so I'm only going to touch base on the settings that are most commonly used. The next few settings here, this is basically for alerting your internal employees when someone is dialing a call on a specific inbound route. So what do I mean by that? Well, alert info. If you have Clearly devices, Sangoma devices, Digium devices, you can set the ringtone differently on these calls that come into this particular inbound route. When we set up phone systems by default, we usually set one ringtone for extension-to-extension internal calls, and then we set up a different ringtone for calls that come in from the outside world. So if you're sitting there working and you hear your phone ring off to the side of your desk, even before you look at it, even before you pick it up, you're going to know just based on the ringtone if it's an internal call or a call coming in from the outside world. You could also have multiple different ringtones for different calls coming in from the outside world, such as if you wanted a different ring for calls that come into, general customer service versus calls that come into, technical support or billing or something like that. Then we have ring volume override. This allows you to set the ring volume from 1 to 14 on your devices. So even if I have turned down my ringer all the way, this allows us to override whatever I have set on my individual phone and just make it ring like super loud, right? So we don't use this a lot, but you could use that if you want. Then we have caller ID name prefix. So caller ID name prefix, we're going to not use it on this route, but we will use it on the next one that we set up. Basically, this is another way to distinguish calls. And what this does is when you receive a call and you see the caller ID of the person calling on the screen of your phone, this is something that we can prepend to that caller ID. So for instance, it can say sales : That way, when you look at the phone, you see the phone's ringing, you look at it, and you can see it's going to say sales and then the caller ID of the person calling in. So essentially, you know that it was someone who came into the sales queue or dialed the sales phone number, something like that. So we're just going to kill that out. Music on hold we're going to set to default, and then we want a destination. Now, for the purposes of this video, we're just going to set the destination to be one of these extensions. But typically you're going to set the destination to be an automated attendant or a ring group or something like that. And we're going to expand upon this and get to those more advanced features later in the series. But for now, we're just going to go direct to an extension. So when someone calls and they have any phone number and they're calling from any phone number, we're going to send them to extensions, Michael Scott, which is this Crosstalk phone right here. Now let's look at some of these other tabs. If we click on advanced, there's really nothing here that we would need to change off of the default, but again, read through these tabs and see if there's anything that you may need to set for your own particular situation. If we click on the privacy tab, this allows us to enable the privacy manager if we want. The privacy manager basically takes any call that comes in that does not have a caller ID. So if it's, unavailable or just blank, if it just doesn't exist, if the caller ID doesn't exist, Privacy Manager is going to intercept that call, and it's going to say, we do not accept calls that don't have a caller ID. Please enter your caller ID to continue, or please enter the phone number you're calling from, and then they put in a 10-digit number, up to a 10-digit number, and then the call gets through with whatever they entered. So this is a way to stop some spam calls that come through with like the unavailable caller ID. If it's an automated call, that call's never going to hit your PBX because no one's going to be on the other end of that call to type in, their 10-digit caller ID and then forward their call through. But if there is a human on the other end, in theory, they would hear that and say, oh, that's weird. Okay, well, let me just put in my phone number, and then the call would come through. So we're going to leave that off in this case. Fax we're going to skip. We are not detecting faxes on this inbound route. And then we're going to click on Other. So for Other, we have our call recording options, and then we have caller ID options. So what's the caller ID lookup source, or the superfecta lookup, or the superfecta scheme? These are all related to separate databases for caller ID that you might have set up separately. Those are beyond the scope of this video tutorial series. In most cases, you are going to receive caller ID name and number from the carrier. You don't need a separate external caller ID lookup source. But that option is here if you want it. And why would you want that? Well, sometimes you might want to do caller ID lookups and replace the name, like whatever phone number they're calling in, you might want to replace the name with a company name that you're pulling out of your CRM database or something like that, right? So you can start to do some fancy stuff like that, but for the purposes of this video, we're just going to leave everything default and click Submit. And then Apply Config. So now let's go ahead and test this out. I'm going to call from my phone, and I'm going to call our main phone number, which is 207-2040. It's going to ring this extension. Then I'm going to call our second phone number, which is 272-770-0266. And it's also going to call this phone. Since all we have is a default catch-all route set up, it's going to catch any calls that come into the system. So let's start with our first number. All right, 272-207-2040, we're calling. And we can see that this phone is ringing, right? So my Crosstalk phone is ringing. That is my Michael Scott extension. Let's call our second DID, which is 272-770-0266. Call that number. And again, the Michael Scott extension is ringing. All right, so let's go ahead and hang that up. Okay, so let's add another inbound route, but we're going to take that second phone number and we're going to direct it to this extension over here instead. Okay, so we're going to say add inbound route. We're going to call this, I think this is Jim Halpert's extension, so we're going to say dial Jim. And then Jim's caller ID phone number is going to be either 10 digits or 11 digits. And that's going to depend on your carrier. So like with Crosstalk SIP, by default, when we send you calls, we are sending 11-digit caller IDs. So if you tried to route with a 10-digit caller ID, it's not going to match. You have to use 1 plus the area code and the phone number. And as long as you know what format your carrier is sending calls to you in, this shouldn't be any sort of problem. So we're going to say 1-272-770-0266 is the number that we want to match inbound, right? This is the number that they're dialing. And then we're going to leave all of this default. We're going to choose the destination to be extensions 202 Jim Halpert. All of these other tabs we're going to leave default and click Submit and Apply Config. Okay, so let's do the test one more time. I'm going to call my first DID, my main DID, which is going to be 272-207-2040. This is going to hit my catch-all route, and it should dial the Michael Scott extension. There we go. Let's make sure we have two-way audio. Hello, hello?
Hello?
Test, test, test. Oh, well, it's not on speakerphone. Test, test, test.
All
All right, there we go. Ah. So yes, we have two-way audio. Now let's call our second DID, 272-770-0266. This time, it should ring over here. There we go. Hello, hello?
Hello?
Check, check, check.
Check, check, check.
Test, 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 test. There we go. So now we have two-way audio on both of those inbound calls, where one we are directing to this phone here, and the other one we are directing to this phone over here. And you can get a lot fancier with inbound routing. We are going to dig more into inbound routing further in this series, but for now that is just a simple setup to get you started. And in our next video, we are finally going to start digging into auto attendants, or what's also known as IVRs. And we are going to do a full IVR design with queues and ring groups and everything that you might encounter in the real world, and then we are going to implement that entire IVR throughout much of the rest of the series here. Okay, so make sure you like and subscribe to catch all of the new videos that come out, and we will see you in the next one.